Imagine an operating room without machines, no anesthesia, no way to escape the pain, only cold metal instruments, and the surgeon's hands that don't tremble. In the Victorian era, surgery wasn't a fight for life, it was a race against time. Who was faster, the surgeon or the human scream? Patients were held, doctors cut, and silence was considered a sign of courage. This is not a story about blood. This is a story about fear that had to be swallowed, about pain that couldn't be numbed, and about medicine that didn't yet know compassion, but already knew how to cut quickly. Stay tuned, because ahead is a quiet, cold history of operations, performed live. Before the light. Take a slow breath, and another one, longer, calmer. Today we will go where medicine did not yet know how to give sleep. To where a person remained conscious, not because he wanted to, but because there was no other way. The Victorian era loved order. It loved rules. It loved clean collars, even rows, beautiful facades. But behind the facades of hospitals lived another truth: quiet, cold, practical. There, in the dim rooms, with the smell of soap, metal, and wet cloth, pain was not an accident. It was part of the procedure, part of the craft, part of the price. Imagine a city under a low sky, stone and soot. A morning that begins with the rumble of wheels and the clatter of horseshoes. People hurry past a building that you don't want to look at for long. The windows are dimmed. The stairs are streaked with dirt and rain. This is a hospital, not the one we imagine today. This is a place where hope and fear are so closely intertwined that it is difficult to separate them. The operating room here does not look like a sterile room. It is more like a stage. In some hospitals, it was really a theater, an amphitheater with rows for students, sometimes even for respected spectators. Not because they are cruel, but because knowledge was acquired with the eyes back then. Medicine taught us to see. The light is harsh, directed. Daylight, if you are lucky with the weather. Lamps, if not. The table is wooden or heavy, simple. Nearby is a bowl of water, towels, a few instruments arranged as if they were cutlery, and the silence before the beginning, which you can almost touch. The surgeon enters not as a hero or an executioner. He enters as a master, as a man entrusted with a task. He is dressed in dark clothes. His hands are gloved, or simply as clean as they could be cleaned back then. The instruments sparkle, not with beauty, but with cold. There will be no long speeches here. There will be no words like, "You're going to fall asleep now." There is no merciful pause here, in which the brain shuts down and retreats. There is only one chance. Do it quickly. In Victorian surgery, speed was sometimes considered the best form of compassion. The patient, he does not lie relaxed. He sits or lies down so that he can be held. He is told to breathe evenly, but breathing evenly here is almost impossible. Nearby are the assistants. Their hands are ready, not to strike, to fixate, to prevent the body from doing what the body always does when it is afraid: break free. At this moment, a person often thinks not of death. Strangely enough, but not of death. It thinks of the second, of the first touch of metal. of a sound that is not loud but unforgettable, the brief clang of the instrument against the edge of the bowl. And then time changes. It contracts. It stretches. It becomes a narrow tunnel in which only the present exists. Victorian culture sometimes spoke of courage, of endurance, of not showing weakness. But in the operating room, these words became very concrete. Here, courage did not mean beautiful phrases, but the ability not to scream, or to scream so as not to faint. The body tries to escape into simple mechanisms: sweat, trembling, cold fingers, dry mouth. Eyes search for a point on the ceiling to grab onto. Someone prays. Someone counts. Someone repeats a single word, as if it could become a door from this place. But the surgeon looks differently. He looks at the form, at the edges, at the fabrics, the way a craftsman looks at wood or leather. Not because he is heartless, but because if he allows himself to feel everything, his hands will become slower. And slowness here is a danger. We are used to thinking that the scariest thing is the incision itself. But sometimes the scariest thing is the moment before it, when you can still imagine, when the brain draws everything it can and doesn't stop. That's why many Victorians were afraid not only of illness, they were afraid of the hospital. Not everyone went there voluntarily. Often a person was drawn to the last, because being sick at home is scary but familiar, and in the hospital, scary and unknown. And here it is, in a room where the metal is colder than the air, where the assistant's hands are already nearby, where the surgeon raises the instrument as if it were an extension of his fingers. And in that second, it becomes clear. Anesthesia is not just a medicine. It is the border between two worlds. But we have not crossed this border yet. We are still standing on this side. In a time when medicine was fast and deaf to the scream. And if you are ready, we will go deeper. In the same theater where students learn to watch and patients learn to be silent. Theater of pain. Now we will take another step inside. Not into a room, but into a space where medicine was the performance and knowledge was the spectator. Imagine an amphitheater. The stairs go up in a circle, in rows. Wood rubbed by hands and time. It smells of damp coats, ink, wet wool. Upstairs is darker. Upstairs sit those who watch. Downstairs is light. Downstairs are those who are watched. This is the operating theater. The Victorian era was in love with the idea of progress. It believed that everything could be ordered: factories, cities, human habits, even suffering. Medicine became part of this movement. They wanted to make it precise, predictable, demonstrable, as much as knowledge at the time allowed. And proof at that time often meant one thing: seeing with one's own eyes. That's why there were many in the operating theaters who didn't hold instruments. Students, assistants, young doctors, sometimes distinguished guests. They didn't come for cruelty, they came for learning. By chance, by a unique moment that never happens the same way twice. And the patient wasn't just a person. He became an example. And that changed the atmosphere more than any cold metal could. There's a special silence in the theater of pain. It's not like the silence before bedtime. It's like the silence before a play, when the hall is already full, but the curtain hasn't yet been raised. There's anticipation in the air. Someone coughs. Someone adjusts their collar. Someone tries to keep their face indifferent, although something inside is already tensing. Downstairs at the table, the surgeon sometimes speaks, briefly. He names the case. He explains what he's going to do. His voice is even, practical, almost dry. He speaks as if he were describing a mechanism, as if the human body is a device that needs to be fixed. And there is truth in this. This is how medicine learned not to break down emotionally, because if the surgeon allowed himself to feel all the fear of the patient, his hands would become heavier, and time is of the essence here. The audience in the theater does not applaud. It does not laugh. It breathes more quietly. Sometimes it takes notes. The rustle of the pen on the paper, short and dry, becomes almost part of the ritual. Imagine the moment when the patient is brought up or placed on the table. He is not laid carefully, as in a modern hospital. He is positioned so that it is convenient to work, so that the assistants can hold him, so that the body does not become an obstacle to the process. It sounds cold, but this is exactly what pragmatism looked like at that time. And here it is important to say, the patient was not always poor. Yes, the poor suffered more often. Yes, the poor had less choice. But the operating theater saw different people. The disease did not ask about origin, and injuries occurred both in workshops and on estates. The difference was in another way, in how a person could avoid the hospital if he had money. Could he hire a doctor at home? Could he pay for better conditions? Could he afford to wait or not wait? In the theater of pain, everyone is equal, only for a moment. In the moment when metal touches skin and the body does what the body always does, tries to escape. Very often assistants worked here, not only as medical support, but as physical support. They held shoulders, they held hands, they fixed knees. And they did this not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Because one sudden movement and the instrument can do irreparable harm. The surgeon prepares. His instruments lie on the table or in his hand. The metal shines, but dimly. The lamp gives a pinpoint light, like a spotlight. This circle of light turns everything around into a shadow. Sometimes the surgeon says a phrase that everyone can remember. That speed is important now, that you need to hold on tight, that the patient needs to be supported. And then the work begins. I will not describe the wounds. I will not draw blood. We don't need this to understand the main point. The main point is how a person's face changes when they realize this is really happening and they are not asleep. Sometimes the patient doesn't scream. Sometimes he clenches his teeth so that sweat stands out on his temples. Sometimes he breathes short, ragged breaths, as if trying not to let panic in. Sometimes he faints. And then the doctors work faster, because fainting is a window that can close at any second. In the theater of pain, fainting was a strange grace. Dangerous, but a grace. Those who sit above watch and learn. They learn not to look away. They learn to keep their faces straight. They learn to call what they see in scientific terms, so as not to hear their own inner shudder. Thus was born professional coldness, not as evil, like armor. Victorian medicine was tough, not because people were monsters, but because knowledge was limited. Because there was no such simple, almost magical transition that we consider the norm today. Fall asleep and wake up afterwards. And yet, even in this theater of pain, sometimes something resembling humanity happened. An assistant could lean over and whisper a few soothing words to the patient. Someone could give him water. Someone could shield his eyes from the light. That didn't change the main thing, but it gave the person the feeling that he was not just an object of demonstration. But the theater remained a theater. And when the operation was over, the audience did not immediately disperse. They discussed. They compared techniques. They talked about speed and precision. They mentioned the surgeon's name, like the name of a master. And there was something disturbing about this, as if pain had become part of the curriculum. That is why the advent of anesthesia would later turn everything upside down. It would change not only what the patient felt, it would change the atmosphere of the room. It would take away from the operating theater the main sound that medicine had long tried not to hear. But that is not there yet. For now, our world is a world in which surgery takes place in the presence of many eyes, and pain in the presence of one body. And now, if you are ready, we will get to know better those who kept this world moving at speed and determination. Those who are remembered not for their softness, but for their hands, in seconds, for their reputation as the fastest. To understand Victorian surgery without anesthesia, you need to look beyond the table and instruments. You need to look at the people who stood on the other side of the pain. The 19th century surgeon was not a doctor in the modern sense. He was a craftsman. The history of surgery has long been separate from the history of medicine. Therapists read books, debated, wrote treatises, and surgeons worked with their hands. Their education began not in university classrooms, but in workshops, anatomical rooms, and long hours of observation. Many of them began as apprentices to a senior master. They did not cut right away. First they watched, then they held, then they cleaned, and only over time did they gain the right to make their own move. In Victorian culture, the surgeon had a strange reputation. On the one hand, respect; on the other, a hidden wariness. He was respected for his courage. He was feared for his coldness. He was admired for his precision, and they often did not want to see him as a person capable of compassion, because compassion prevented him from working quickly, and speed was the main currency. Before the advent of anesthesia, the success of an operation was often measured not only by whether the patient survived, but also by how many seconds the procedure lasted. Not minutes, seconds. There were surgeons who were known throughout the country for this. They were spoken of in whispers. They were written about in newspapers. They were invited from other cities if the case was complicated. Not because they were gentler, but because they were faster. Imagine what fast meant in this context. This is not haste. This is control. A movement that does not stop. A hand that does not doubt. An eye that knows exactly where the line is drawn. A surgeon had to remember anatomy as if it were painted on the inside of his eyelids. A mistake cost more than just reputation. It could cost a person their life, or leave them with a disability that would remind them of themselves for the rest of their days. So training was tough, and often ruthless. Students saw more than they wanted to. They heard more than they could forget. And they learned not to look away, because looking away meant weakness. And weakness was not forgiven in this profession. Interestingly, many of the famous surgeons of that era had a reputation for being strange people. Some were withdrawn. Some were sharp. Some were almost mechanical in their communication. It wasn't always innate. Often it was acquired. Because in order to cut living flesh day after day, not out of hatred, but out of necessity. It was necessary to rebuild a wall within oneself, a wall between work and feelings, a wall between a scream and a movement of the hand. And this wall made them effective, but it also distanced them from the world. A surgeon of the Victorian era often lived in two realities. In the first, he was precise, fast, almost infallible. In the second, an ordinary person who could lie awake at night remembering faces, not wounds. But this was not written about in textbooks. Society wanted to see a surgeon as a symbol of progress, a person who is not afraid of what others turn away from. And that is why surgery became an arena of courage, in the distorted sense of the word. The patient had to be courageous because he suffered, the surgeon because he cut, and each of them paid a price. In this system, compassion didn't disappear completely. It simply changed form. It became efficiency. "I'll do it quickly" meant, "I'll reduce your suffering." That was the logic of the era. Not intentionally cruel, but forced. And that's why, when the opportunity to remove pain presented itself, many surgeons wouldn't believe it at first. Not because they loved suffering, but because their entire professional identity was built around dealing with it through speed. Imagine everything you were known for suddenly becoming less necessary. That your main virtue, second best, no longer mattered. It would be a painful transition, but we'll get to that later. Instruments that speak instead of words. Before there was pain, there was metal. In the Victorian operating room, instruments were language. They spoke of what was going to happen next, even before the surgeon lifted his hand. Sometimes just a glance at the table was enough to make a patient's heart beat faster. These were not elegant, hidden instruments. They were not hidden in drawers. They lay out in the open, heavy, shiny, cold. Knives, saws, forceps, hooks. Each had a shape, a purpose, and a character. And each carried a simple, ruthless honesty. I am here to cut, to hold, to separate. Metal was rougher then than it is today. Less polished, more signs of use. Scratches, dull edges, stains that never quite went away. And there was something disturbing about that, because the instruments didn't look new. They looked experienced. The patient saw it. Even if he tried not to look, he saw it out of the corner of his eye. And he understood. These objects had already touched other bodies. Many bodies. Sterility, in the modern sense, did not yet exist. Hands were washed, instruments were wiped, but the idea of invisible enemies, bacteria, had not yet become generally accepted. Instead, they believed in smells, in bad air, in miasmas that supposedly caused disease. That's why operating rooms were often cold. Windows were opened, the air was changed. But metal remained metal, the same metal that had just been used. And yet instruments were a source of pride. Surgeons cared for them the way a master cares for his tools. They knew every curve, every weight, every balance in the hand. Some carried their own sets with them. Some ordered them from masters, specially for their own style of movement. Because at the moment of the operation, the tool had to become an extension of the fingers. There was no room for doubt. If the hand hesitated, the metal did too much. And the extra movement meant extra seconds of pain. Therefore, the tools were learned to feel, even before the surgeon began to work. They lay familiarly in the palm of his hand. They weighed exactly as much as needed, and they did not forgive mistakes. For the student, the sight of this table was an initiation. Some turned pale, some swallowed, Some tried to keep calm, even if something inside was clenching. Because the table with the tools was the limit. After him, medicine ceased to be abstract. It became physical. And for the patient, this table was another form of warning. Without words, without explanations, just a fact. It will happen now. Sometimes the surgeon would take an instrument and lightly weigh it in his hand, as if checking, as if reminding himself, I am ready. In these seconds, the patient would often hold his breath, not because it was easier, but because the body instinctively tried to reduce the presence in his own body. Some closed their eyes. Some looked away. Some, on the contrary, could not look away. Because the instruments, strangely enough, gave a sense of control. They were concrete, unlike the pain that was just approaching. In Victorian culture, there was a belief. If you see it, you are ready. If you are ready, you can endure it. This was not always true, but it was a belief that helped people cross the threshold of the operating room. The instruments were silent witnesses to thousands of stories. They did not know names. They did not remember faces, but they remembered movements. Every scratched edge is someone's moment, someone's second, someone's limit of endurance. And although we look at these objects in museums today, behind glass, under soft light, in the Victorian operating room, they were alive. Not in a mystical sense, but in a practical sense. They demanded respect, and they inspired fear. Because they were the reminder, there is no sleep here. There is no pause here. There is only movement here. And you are present with it. The patient without a choice. Now we will stop. Not at the table, but on this side. Here, where a person stands or lies for whom medicine has ceased to be a theory. In Victorian England, a patient almost never came to surgery calmly. Even those who consciously decided to have it did not come without fear. Because fear was reasonable. People knew what surgery was. They talked about it. They whispered about it in the markets, in workshops, in kitchens. They warned each other about it as they warn about a fire or a collapse. They will cut you alive. This was not a metaphor. This was a fact. And yet, people came, often not because they wanted to be cured, but because there was no other way out. Gangrene, broken bones that would not heal, tumors, infections after minor wounds. What started as pain became life-threatening. The body gave an ultimatum, and the hospital was the last stop. Before surgery, the patient was often not prepared in the way we are used to today. Not with soothing words, but with warnings. They could tell him directly, "It will hurt, very much hurt, but if you can endure it, there is a chance." And the important word here is endure it. Endurance was part of the treatment, not medically, culturally. In Victorian society, there was an idea that pain could be endured, that character and willpower could influence the outcome, that screaming was weakness and silence was virtue. It was unfair, but it was reality. Some patients asked to be tied up in advance, not out of compulsion, but out of understanding, because they knew that at some point the body would stop obeying the mind. And this was one of the most difficult realizations. You may want to stay calm, but your body has its own plan. Your arms may twitch. Your legs may twitch. Your breathing may break. And all this happens not because you are weak, but because the nervous system is designed to save. The patients made a deal with themselves. Some counted the seconds. Some repeated prayers. Some asked not to say anything else, so as not to hear their own voices. Sometimes a relative was standing nearby, sometimes not. Not everyone could stand the spectacle, and not everyone had the right to be present. For many patients, the most terrible thing was not the pain itself, but the anticipation. This silence before the beginning. The moment when the instrument has not yet touched, but you already know it will. Waiting stretches time. 1 minute seems like an hour. One sound is too loud. The patient hears everything. Footsteps, breathing, metal on metal. And in this oversaturated silence, thoughts become simple. Not philosophical, not deep. If only it were faster. If only I didn't faint too soon. If only it worked. It is important to say here, many patients were not heroes. They did not want to prove anything to the world. They simply wanted to live. Sometimes they screamed. Sometimes they did not. And none of these options made them better or worse. But society saw it differently. Those who stood it gained a reputation. They were spoken of with respect. Their pain became part of a shared story. This did not mean that they did not suffer. It meant that their suffering was given meaning in a culture that was so afraid of meaningless pain. For the doctor, the patient was both a person and a task. Not because the doctor did not feel compassion, but because compassion had to be kept in check. For if the surgeon paused, if he allowed himself a moment of doubt, the price could be higher. And in this tension, between the patient's fear and the doctor's necessity, Victorian surgery without anesthesia was born. It was not just a technique. It was an agreement. Unspoken, cruel, but mutual. The patient promised to endure. Doctor, do it quickly. And both knew, if something goes wrong, no one will escape the blame. Speed as mercy. In a world without anesthesia, time had a different weight. It wasn't measured in minutes. It was felt in nerves. Every extra second wasn't just a delay. It was an extra layer of pain that the body had to absorb. And that's why in Victorian surgery, speed became not a character trait, but an ethical principle. Fast meant less painful. Not painless, but less. Surgeons trained to be fast the way others trained to be precise. Movements were practiced dozens of times. Sequences of actions were learned by heart. Instruments were always laid out in the same order. Not for beauty, for memory. When the pain became too much, the brain stopped being reliable. And the surgeon couldn't afford to look with his eyes for the right instrument. The hand had to know the way by itself. The assistants were also part of this speed. They knew when to hold tighter, when to let go, when to hand over the next object without words. The operation turned into silent coordination, like a dance in which all the movements were known in advance. And any improvisation was dangerous. There were surgeons who boasted about their time, not out of vanity, but as proof of professionalism. Amputation in 2 minutes, less than 90 seconds. These numbers sound cold, but behind them was the desire to reduce suffering when there were no other means. The patient knew this. Sometimes, even before the operation, he would ask not, "Will it hurt?" but, "How quickly will you do it?" There was no naivety in this question, only pragmatism. Speed did not mean haste. Haste leads to mistakes. And a mistake is new pain, new blood, a new threat. Therefore, a surgeon had to be fast and calm at the same time. It was a difficult combination, and not everyone could withstand it. Some broke down. Some left the profession. Some stayed, but became tougher. Not towards patients, but towards themselves. Interestingly, many contemporaries noted the fastest surgeons were often the most impulsive. They did not explain unnecessary things. They did not discuss. They did not allow themselves to doubt in their voices, because doubt slows down. At this moment, compassion changed form. It ceased to be words. It became a pace. I will not stop. I will not let the pain last longer than necessary. I will do it now. It was a silent promise that the surgeon made to the patient, without looking into his eyes, without taking his hand, but taking responsibility. And yet speed had its limits. Sometimes the body couldn't take it. Sometimes the pain became stronger than consciousness. Fainting was a risk and a relief at the same time. Risk because the heart might not be able to take it. Relief because the pain receded, at least for a moment. Surgeons knew this, and they worked as if every second was the last safe one. It was in this tension that legends were born, about iron hands, about the fastest in London, about the one who makes it before the pain takes over. But along with the legends came fatigue, because even the fastest could not escape the consequences. The price of survival. When the operation was over, the pain did not disappear. It changed shape. It became duller. It spread through the body like a heavy fog that settles after a storm. For a modern person, this may seem unexpected. In Victorian surgery, the operation was not the culmination. It was only the beginning of another ordeal. The patient was carried, carefully, as much as conditions allowed, not to a sterile ward, but to a room where smells mixed. Medicines, sweat, metal, damp fabric, human breath. The body was exhausted, not only from pain, but from tension. The nervous system worked at the limit, and now that the acute threat had passed, it often let go too abruptly. Shock began. The person might tremble, turn pale, falling into a strange state between sleep and wakefulness. The eyes looked but did not see. The ears heard but did not understand. Back then, they did not always know what was happening. There were no clear protocols. There were no precise explanations. The doctors saw the result, but did not always understand the mechanism. Sometimes, the patient survived the operation, but did not survive the next night. This was a particularly cruel realization, because a person had already been through the worst, had already endured, had already done everything that was required of him, and yet the body could not withstand it any longer. Moreover, survival did not always mean recovery. Amputations saved lives, but changed them forever. People woke up with a sense of loss that could not be prepared for in words. The arm or leg was no longer there, but the feeling of its presence remained. Phantom pain, not yet fully understood at the time, could torment for years. And then there was silence again. Another, post-operative. It was the silence of exhaustion, a silence in which one no longer had the strength to scream, a silence in which one listened to one's own breathing and waited to see if it would be the next to disappear. Post-operative care was simple and uneven. Some were more fortunate, some were less fortunate. Clean dressings were changed, wounds were examined, but infections came without warning. Sometimes the wound looked fine in the morning, and by evening it was already hot, painful, and dangerous. And then the doctors were faced with a choice again. Cut again. Wait. Take a risk. The patient often did not have the strength to argue. He had already given his body to the system, and now all that was left was to trust. This trust was fragile, sometimes blind, sometimes forced. Survivors changed their attitude towards life. They didn't necessarily become wiser. Often they became quieter. Because when you've seen how close the limit can get, unnecessary words seem unnecessary. Victorian medicine slowly learned from these costs, on those who didn't survive, on those who survived but paid for with years of pain. It was here, in the post-operative silence, that the question that would later change everything began to arise. Is pain really a necessary part of treatment, or is it simply something we haven't yet learned to remove? Infection, the silent enemy. Sometimes the greatest danger didn't strike. It came silently. In a Victorian hospital, infection didn't look like an enemy. It had no face. It didn't scream. It didn't come suddenly like the pain of a knife. It came back slowly, after hours, after days, and often when it seemed the worst was behind it. The air in hospitals at that time was heavy, not just from body odors and drugs, but from a constant fear that didn't yet have a name. Doctors spoke of bad air, of miasmas that supposedly seeped into wounds. They opened windows, they aired the wards, and they believed that fresh air was the best defense. They were wrong not because they were stupid, but because they were limited in their knowledge. Instruments were passed from one patient to another. Hands were washed, but not in the way we think of them today. Bandages were reused. Wards were overcrowded. And each of these factors was an invitation to an invisible enemy. Infection came silently. First, warmth around the wound. Then throbbing pain. Then fever. The patient began to delirium. Words lost their meaning. Time fell apart. Sometimes doctors understood what was happening but didn't know what to do. They saw the body become a battlefield again. Only this time the enemy was invisible. Sepsis. Purulent complications. Inflammation spreading out of control. These were words that were not always spoken aloud, but everyone knew the consequences. Sometimes the operation was successful. The arm or leg was saved. The tumor was removed. But after a few days, the patient grew weaker. The eyes grew dim. The breathing became shallow. And the doctors could do nothing but wait. This was especially painful for the surgeons, because they knew their work was done perfectly. The movements were precise. The time was minimal. But victory was slipping away. Some doctors began to suspect that the problem was not only in the air, that something was being transferred by the hands, by the instruments, by the process itself. But these thoughts, the threshold of a new world. Sometimes history changes quietly, without fanfare, without the realization that something irreversible had just happened. This is how the journey to sleep began. In the mid-19th century, the idea of removing pain from surgery seemed almost daring. Not because doctors were cruel, but because pain was considered inevitable, part of reality, part of the truth of the body. A person could faint from pain. They could lose consciousness from shock. But falling asleep at the doctor's request, it seemed dangerous and even unnatural. The first substances that began to attract attention were already known. Ether, chloroform. They were played with at fairs. They were inhaled for laughter, strange sensations, brief dizziness. It was entertainment, not medicine. And that is why the idea of using these substances during surgery caused distrust. Surgeons were not afraid of pain. They were afraid of silence that did not correspond to reality. Because when a patient is silent, but not because of endurance, but because of loss of consciousness, the doctor loses feedback. How to understand that a person is still alive. How to feel the limit. How not to go too far. In Victorian medicine, the body spoke through pain. And suddenly there was an opportunity to make it shut up. The first attempts were cautious, almost secret, without an audience, without amphitheaters. Someone allowed the patient to inhale the ether only a little. Someone dared to do more. And each time they waited, not so much for the success of the operation, but for whether the person would wake up. These minutes were also stressful for the doctor, because now the responsibility was doubled. Now the patient could not say enough. He could not flinch. He could not run away. The body lay still, and that was frightening. Some surgeons described this experience as something unnaturally quiet. An operating room where there was no screaming, no muscle tension, no struggle, only even breathing, if you were lucky. And sometimes it became difficult to catch it. Not all attempts were successful. The doses were unknown. Reactions were different. Some fell asleep deeply, some only lightly. And it was these failures that fueled fear. Because when something goes wrong in a silent operating room, it looks scarier than screaming. And yet something was changing. Those who saw the first successful cases could not forget them. The operation proceeded more slowly. The movements became more precise. Time ceased to be the enemy. And most importantly, the patient did not remember. This idea seemed almost miraculous, to go through the pain and not carry it with you. For patients, it was hope. For doctors, it was a challenge. For medicine, it was a threshold beyond which another world began. But any threshold is scary, because crossing it, you leave behind everything familiar, even if this familiarity is cruel. The sleep that changed medicine. When the pain first disappeared, no one applauded. There were no cheers. There was no sense of triumph. Only silence, new, unfamiliar, almost unsettling. The operating room, where the person lay motionless not because they were being held, but because they were asleep, seemed like a place from another time. The surgeons did not immediately understand what was happening. They knew that the instruments were touching the body. They knew that the work was going on. But the brain refused to accept the main thing. The pain was no longer controlling the process. It felt wrong, as if they were breaking an unspoken contract between the body and the mind. Before, screaming, moving, tension, all these were signals. The body spoke. The body warned. The body set limits. Now, silence. And in this silence, the doctors were left alone with responsibility for the first time. No prompts, no reaction, no feedback. Some of them confessed later they were more scared than ever before. Because if the patient doesn't react, you have to believe not in his endurance, but in your own knowledge. The operations became longer. The movements were more careful. Hands were no longer in a hurry. And this was the turning point, where before they cut quickly, now they started working precisely. Where before they were afraid of an extra second, now they allowed themselves to think. A new rhythm appeared. The patient was breathing evenly. The face was calm. The muscles offered no resistance. For many surgeons, it looked almost like a miracle. And for some, it looked like a threat. Because if pain no longer limited the operation, would the doctor go too far? Would he lose his sense of boundaries? Society also had mixed reactions. Some considered anesthesia dangerous, an intervention in the natural order, a manipulation that could take life no worse than a knife. The newspapers wrote about successes and failures, about those who did not wake up, about those whose breathing stopped too quietly for anyone to notice in time. The fear did not disappear immediately. It simply changed form. But for patients, something new appeared. Hope without heroism. Now they did not have to prove their courage. They did not have to be silent. They did not have to endure to deserve treatment. You could fall asleep and wake up on the other side. For people who lived in a world where pain was a constant companion of life, it sounded incredible. For women, children, the elderly, it was a real salvation. And for medicine, it was a rebirth. Surgery ceased to be a race against time and began to become a science of precision. It was from this moment that hospitals slowly changed. They began to think about cleanliness, about instruments, about hands, about the environment. Because if you stop rushing, you start to notice. Anesthesia did not immediately make medicine safe. It did not erase infections. It did not eliminate mistakes. It did not save everyone. But it did the main thing. It gave a person the right not to be present in his own pain. And this right changed everything. When pain stopped being the rule, change never comes overnight, even when it seems obvious. Anesthesia didn't make Victorian medicine humane overnight. It only opened a door. But behind that door, you still had to learn how to walk. Surgeons who had spent years building their skills around speed now found themselves in a different world, a world where time was no longer the enemy. And that required a reorientation, not just of their hands, but of their minds. Some welcomed the change with relief. They felt they could finally work the way they had always wanted to, but couldn't. Thoughtfully, carefully, with respect for every layer of tissue. Others felt anxious, for when pain no longer held back the process, a new question arose. Where is the limit now? Previously, the body set the limits. Now these restrictions had to be set by the doctor. And that was not easy. Society was also changing slowly. Many people still feared anesthesia more than the knife for a long time. They knew pain. They understood it. But the sleep induced by a chemical seemed suspicious. Some refused. They asked to operate the old way. Not because they were braver, but because the familiar was less frightening than the new. But gradually, the fear began to recede. Stories appeared. People told each other how they fell asleep and woke up without memories of the worst. These stories were passed on quietly, without newspaper headlines, without official statements, just in a human voice. And with them, attitudes towards pain changed. Pain used to be almost a moral category. It was considered a test, something that had to be overcome in order to deserve healing. Now another idea emerged. If pain could be eliminated, then perhaps it had never been necessary. This was a revolutionary realization, and it affected more than just surgery. It affected obstetrics, dentistry, the way children were treated. Society slowly began to recognize that to endure was not to be strong, and to remain silent was not to be worthy. But old ideas do not disappear without a trace. Even when pain ceased to be the rule, its shadow lingered in hospitals for a long time, in the attitudes of doctors, in the fears of patients, in the memories of those who had lived before. Some surgeons did not live to see this transition, and did not see how the world changed. And some lived to see it, and felt a strange feeling, relief mixed with regret. Because along with the pain, the need for that cold endurance that once defined the profession disappeared, and not everyone was ready to let go of this identity. But medicine could not go back. When the opportunity to treat without suffering arises, it becomes impossible to give it up. And that is why the Victorian era left behind a strange legacy. It showed how far medicine can go without compassion, and at the same time, how much the world changes when compassion becomes technically possible. Pain ceased to be a necessary condition for treatment, but the memory of it did not disappear anywhere. It remained in archives, in memories, in old instruments behind museum glass. And perhaps it is this memory that makes modern medicine more attentive, because it reminds us what seems inevitable today may become unacceptable tomorrow. Silent gratitude. Now we can stop. Not in the hospital, not in the operating room, but here, in a silence that no longer needs to be feared. The world we live in today is accustomed to sleep, to the fact that pain can be removed, to the fact that treatment does not have to leave memories that make it difficult to breathe. And that is why it is so easy to forget at what cost it became possible. Victorian surgery without anesthesia was not just a stage in the development of medicine. It was the limit of human endurance, the limit between what a person is able to endure and what society considered acceptable. Thousands of people passed through operating rooms having no choice. They did not leave behind diaries. They did not become heroes of books. Their names were often not preserved. But it was their experiences that became the basis of change. They showed that pain is not a proof of strength, but a signal that something is wrong. It was their screams, their silence, their endurance that forced medicine to look for another path. And this path led to a simple, almost imperceptible miracle. A person can sleep while being treated. When today we hear the even sound of breathing in the operating room, when we see the patient's closed eyes, when we know that he will not remember the worst, we use the legacy of those who once did not have this protection. And here it is important not to judge the past from the perspective of the present. The doctors of that era were not monsters. They worked with what they had. They made mistakes. They doubted. They learned, often from someone else's pain. And at the same time, it is important to remember. Remember that progress does not appear out of thin air. That humanity in medicine is not only a matter of morality, but also a matter of opportunity. When opportunities were not available, people did what they thought was necessary. When they were available, the world could no longer be the same. Today, silence in a hospital means something else. It means safety, control, trust. And this silence is the result of a long journey on which there was much darkness. Perhaps that is why it is worth remembering this story sometimes. Not for fear, but for gratitude, for sleep, for pain relief, for the fact that treatment no longer requires heroism. And now that this story is coming to an end, let the silence remain, but a different one, the one in which you can rest, the one in which you do not have to endure, the one that means you are safe. Thank you for being there. May the night be peaceful, and may the silence today be kind.